Hello, Hadley and Eliza. It is Saturday night, or Saturday afternoon anyways, and we are on part 5 of the Hoboken chicken emergency. If you remember in the last time I read, oh, hold on, let me turn my phone off here so it doesn't ring. So in the last time we read, Arthur just had to take Henrietta back to the professor because his parents said that Henrietta was too big and too difficult to keep around the house. So he's feeling very sad because he just dropped Henrietta off at Professor Manicotti's. So oops, let me turn this way so I get a little more light. Okay. Arthur knew he'd always be miserable without Henrietta. He knew he would never really forget. He knew he would never really forgive his father for not giving her a second chance. In the short time that Henrietta had been with him, Arthur had gotten used to her. When he went to bed that night, it seemed wrong to him that she was not sleeping on the rug next to his bed. He dreamed of chickens, big ones. Arthur was a ringmaster in his dream. He had a beautiful red coat with a gold braid and buttons, and there were maybe 15 chickens performing tricks. Arthur had a whip. He would snap the whip and shout, "Hup!" and the chickens would do somersaults, "Hup!" onto one another's shoulders and do headstands. Then there was a roll of drums, and Arthur shouted, "Hup! Hup! Hup! Hup!" and the chickens began to form a chicken pyramid. 5 chickens stood in a row. Then 4 chickens hopped onto their shoulders. Then 3 chickens, then 2, and finally 1 chicken on top with an American flag in her beak. It was beautiful. All 15 chickens making a pyramid more than 30 feet high, waving their wings and clucking. The flag on top, snap, 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 went the whip. And then on a huge black horse, Henrietta appeared. She was standing on the horse on 1 foot. The horse galloped around and around the pyramid of chickens. Henrietta waved to the crowd. The crowd was going wild. They were cheering. They were screaming, screaming, screaming. They were screaming hysterically. Arthur was waking up. He could still hear the screaming of the crowd. It didn't sound as much like a crowd now as it sounded like Mrs. Gluckenstern downstairs. It sounded to Henry as though Mrs. Gluckenstern had her head stuck outside the window and was screaming all sorts of things like "Help!" and "Police!" Arthur opened his own window and poked his head out just in time to see a large white form scurrying down the fire escape that ran past his bedroom window, and Mrs. Gluckenstern's window too. The whole thing disappeared into the shadows. Windows opened, lights were turned on. Mrs. Gluckenstern continued to scream. It was looking straight through the Venetian blinds. A monster, a gorilla, all white with red eyes. It was a gorilla as big as a horse. The telephone rang. Arthur could hear his father talking. "No, it wasn't our chicken, Papa," Arthur said. No, his Papa said. "My son got rid of the chicken this afternoon. Maybe it was a burglar in a white overcoat. Just a coincidence." Papa hung up. Arthur could hear him walking towards Arthur's bedrooms. "You did get rid of that chicken, didn't you, son?" Papa asked. "Yes, Papa," Arthur said. The family went back to bed. Arthur had a hard time falling asleep. Had it been a burglar? Maybe Henrietta had gotten loose. She could be looking for him. If she was loose in Hoboken at night, she would probably get scared. Who would feed her? Arthur made up his mind to go to Professor Manicotti's house early in the morning just to check up on things and say hello to Henrietta. Oh, I could get all close here, couldn't I? Oh, look at the camera too, couldn't I? The family went back to bed. Arthur had a hard time falling asleep. Had it been a burglar? Maybe Henrietta had gotten loose. She would be looking for him. If she were loose in Hoboken at night, she would probably be scared. I think I read that part. Who would feed her? Arthur made up his mind to go to Professor Manicotti's early in the morning just to check up on things and say hello to Henrietta. Just in case you didn't get it, I read it again. Arthur arrived outside Professor Manicotti's apartment house. He arrived outside Professor Mazzicotti's apartment house just in time to see the professor locking the doors on a big green truck. Augie's truck rental, it said on the side. From the muffled clicking and screeching, Arthur could tell that all of the professor's experiments were inside. "Professor Mazzicotti," Arthur shouted, "are you going away?" "Just for a little while, my boy," Professor Mazzicotti said. "All of a sudden, I felt like visiting my sister in Pennsylvania. I'll be back after a while." The professor was hurrying around Checking the tires, sorry. Professor, did Henrietta get loose? Arthur asked. Who told you that? The professor looked frightened. Did someone tell you that number 73 was loose? I think I saw her, Arthur said. I'm worried about her. You're worried? You're worried? Professor Matakazi was getting very excited. I'm worried. Do you know what happens to people when one of my experiments gets loose? They go crazy. One time they burned down my house. Burned it down. It was a beautiful old castle, and they burned it down right to the ground. Professor Matakazi ran around the truck again, making sure that all the doors were locked tight. But Professor Mazzacati, Arthur said, Henrietta is wandering around the streets of Hoboken all alone. She must be frightened and cold and hungry. Don't you care what happens to her? Of course I do, Professor Mazzacati said. But when you've been a mad scientist as long as I have, you learn some things are more important than others. More important, right now, is for me to get out of town with all my experiments. If the news gets around that I am responsible for a very large chicken loose in the streets, people will start acting crazy. You and I know that number 73 is a very gentle chicken, but people are sometimes afraid of things they've never seen before. When they are afraid, then they do foolish things, like burning down other people's castles. But what about Henrietta? Arthur said. Who's going to take care of her? Look, the professor said. Don't show this to anybody. I'm going to give you my sister's address. If you have any trouble, send me a postcard. I'll help you if I can. The professor wrote something down on a card. It said, Professor Fritz Mazzacati, care of, it's a hard name to read, Cosima Mazzacati, Moonsport, Pennsylvania. Professor Mazzacati started the engine, and the big green truck rumbled away. Anyways, more tomorrow. Love you both. Oh, I might get to see you tomorrow, too, when I come over.